Exactly. So good evening and welcome, everyone. We're delighted to see such a fantastic crowd here on a Friday night. I'm Suzanne Shanahan. I direct the Kenan Institute for Ethics, and Ada Gregory, the Associate Director at the Institute, and I are hosting this evening's festivities. Tonight's program will be a very timely conversation on friendship and faith across political difference. It brings together two preeminent scholars and public intellectuals, Princeton's Robert George and Harvard's Cornel West. They will engage in a conversation moderated by Duke's own Joseph Winters. In many ways, neither George nor West require any introduction, as their many contributions to scholarship and public debate have both separately and together long preceded them. But in a slight departure from standard protocol, I did want to make note of a particular rising star who is seated next to them, Joseph Winters. Joe is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of Religious Studies at Duke University with secondary appointments in the Department of African and African American Studies and the Department of English. His first book, Hope Draped in Black, Race, Melancholy, and the Agony of Progress, examines how Black literature and aesthetic practices challenged both post-racial fantasies and triumphant accounts of freedom. The book shows how authors like W.E.B. Du Bois and Toni Morrison link hope and possibility to melancholy, remembrance, and a recalcitrant sense of the tragic. He leads a faculty working group on race, religion, and volatile political movements, and teaches and writes about religion and hip-hop, religion, race, and film, critical approaches to religious studies, and the general connections between Black studies and critical theory. Joe was tenured just this week. So we are especially delighted that he chose to spend his Friday night with us instead of out celebrating with friends and family. Thank you, Joe. I'm also very touched that both Tom Kenan and Dan Drake from the Kenan Fund are here to enjoy this evening with us. We are always very grateful for their support. This event is co-sponsored by a variety of different units across campus, including the Duke Divinity School, Department of Religious Studies, American Program in Grand Strategy, the Department of African and African American Studies, and the Department of Political Science. Before I turn the program over to Joe, I did want to acknowledge an extraordinary individual who is standing toward the back. That is Amber Diaz-Pearson, research scholar at the Kenan Institute for Ethics. I think, as anyone who's ever planned a distinguished lecture realizes, they are much like weddings. There is much detail and much drama. So thank you, Amber, for her continued alacrity throughout the process and the way she was able to bring the team at the Institute together. I will leave it there to Joe. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me now? No. I'll try to speak up. Can you hear me now? Okay. Thank you for that introduction. I want to thank Kenan Institute for Ethics for inviting me. Amber, thank you very much for inviting me to mediate between these two towering figures. Some way it feels like a reunion, from my Princeton days. So my understanding, the order of the talk will be, so I have some questions, right? So for the next hour, right, I'll try to be ask some questions, and I'll get out the way, because right, so you guys can talk about some of these themes, politics, faith, and friendship. And then the last half hour, we'll open up the conversation to questions from the audience, right? So the first question for both of you has to do with friendship, right? So basically in two parts, right? The first is, how did you guys become friends, right? How has your friendship kind of developed over the years? And I guess the second part is, what is friendship for you? What constitutes friendship, right, for both of you?
Well, first, let me congratulate you on your retirement. And on behalf of both Cornel and myself, let me thank Duke University, the Kenan Center, the Arete Initiative. Director Shanahan, thank you in particular for hosting us today. It's a great honor to be at Duke. I was collected at the airport by a wonderful driver and started doing my work, and he drove me over here, and I got out of the car, and I looked back in the window, and I said, "Sir, why did you drive me back to Princeton? I don't understand. I'm supposed to be at Duke." And then I walked into the chapel, and I was absolutely convinced I was in. I didn't mean the other chapel, the big chapel. What a beautiful university it is. I mean, imitation is the most sincere form of flattery. But when you... Cornel always taught me the first thing you do is get the audience against you. That's some technique. But when you outdo what you imitate, that's pretty impressive. I do want to congratulate you on getting tenure, and of course we're very proud of you at Princeton for all that you've accomplished intellectually, and of course the future is a bright one for you ahead of you. And it is always a very great privilege and honor to be with my dear friend Cornel, someone who I admire not simply because of the quality of the intellect and what he has achieved, but for two other virtues that we're going to be talking about this evening, but no one exemplifies them more fully than Cornel does, and those are the virtues of courage and integrity. Both are in short supply most of the time. I happen to believe they're in particularly short supply today, including, alas, among academics. But Cornel there is such a shining star. I've learned an enormous amount from him, not simply in our conversations or reading his work, but by the example that he set. So thank you, Cornel, for everything you mean to me. Now I will address the question and then kick it over to Cornel. It was almost love at first sight. You do, despite some rather obvious differences, sometimes just find another person interesting. Someone who is saying things that are compelling and need to be said, whether one agrees with them or not, someone who is making you think. So before we ever formally became friends, I would sit in on faculty seminars at Princeton, and I would hear Cornel asking what I thought were exactly the right questions, and then giving exactly the wrong answers. But interesting, provocative, compelling answers. But we really didn't get to know each other very well until one day when I got a knock on my door at my office during office hours from a student of mine named Andrew, who had also, it turns out, been a student of Brother West's. And I welcomed him to my office, and he said, "Professor George, I'm one of a group of students who are putting together a new magazine, a new campus magazine. It's going to be the Princeton campus equivalent of the New Yorker. It's going to be arts and when you know this is when Princeton students, probably like Duke students, they tell you something like that, you learn pretty quickly. Don't laugh. They're going to do it, and they do it. It's arts, culture, politics, literature." I said, "Well, it sounds very interesting." I said, "Have you put together the money?" I thought he was going to ask me to help with the fundraising. He said, "No, we've taken care of the money." He said, "But we're going to have as a feature in the magazine, in every issue, beginning with the inaugural issue, an interview. And the interview will be of one faculty member by another. And we have invited Professor Cornel West to be the interviewer and asked him who on the faculty he would like to interview. And he said that he would like to interview you." would you be willing to be interviewed by Professor West? Now, Andrew was a religion major, very bright, graduated way up there, one of our top students. So I said to Andrew, I said, now let me get this straight. You invited Professor West to do an interview and said he could interview anybody he wanted. And he said he wanted to interview me? And Andrew said, yes, that's right. And I said, well, I want you to send a message back to Professor West. I want you to tell Professor West that Professor George says, but it is I who should be seeking baptism from you. To which Andrew replied, huh? A little biblical literacy issue here with our rising generation. Religion majors. Brilliant kid.
That's true.
And I said, you just tell Professor West that. And he said, well, okay, I'll tell him that, but will you do it? And I said, of course I would do it. I'd be very honored to be interviewed by Professor West. So the appointed day came, and here came Andrew. He had a photographer with him. Remember that guy? Oh, yeah. Snapping the pictures. He must have snapped 1,000 pictures. And Andrew had a recording machine, one of the old-fashioned recording machines. Now you do it all on these phones. But he had an old-fashioned recording machine. So he flipped it on, and he asked the first question like you did. And then, man, we got at it. And we got going. And finally that tape ran out, and he was waving his arm. The camera flashed. He's waving his arms. Said, stop, 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 stop. Didn't want to miss anything. Took the tape out, flipped it over. Okay, go ahead. And we went at it again. Now, if I recall correctly, that began at 2. And we were supposed to go until 3:30 or something. But by the time the tape is finished, we're now in the thick of it. I mean, we were talking about everything. You name it. We were arguing about it, kicking it around. And so finally, I look at my watch, and it's 6 o'clock. Those photographs must exist somewhere. He's still clicking away. So I said, Cornel, this has really been a wonderful conversation, and we really need to get to know each other better. We need to get together. We need to talk. We have a lot of things here. We're interested in the same things. We need to talk about a lot of stuff. I said, but I've got to go home to dinner now. He said, oh, Brother Robbie, that was wonderful. We will do it. Let's make it a point to get together again soon. And I said, well, walk me down to my car. So I walked down to my car in the university parking lot there, back when you could get a parking space. We've now had administratively can't get a parking space. But I went down to the car, and Cornel walked me down there. And I've got my hand on the latch of the car for another half hour while we're going at it. So finally I said, look, my wife's going to wonder what became of me for dinner. So I headed home. Then later that week, it was just a couple of days later, our dean of the college, Nancy Melancholy at the time, sent some of the senior faculty a note saying, we have a wonderful freshman seminar program that we try to use as a selling point with students we admit so they won't go to Duke. We try to get them to come to Princeton. And we advertise the fact that if you come to Princeton, unlike Harvard or Yale, you're going to be taught, even as freshmen, by some of our most senior, most distinguished, famous professors. But the problem is, they're not the senior faculty are not teaching these. We need more volunteers. We need people to teach these. So, well, then the light bulb went off over my head. And I said, gee, wouldn't it be great if Cornel and I could just continue that conversation with 16 or 18, these brilliant young kids at Princeton in their freshman year. So I got in touch with Cornel and proposed it, and Cornel said, that is a wonderful idea. Let's do it. So we decided that we would do it as a kind of great books approach. We would do one book a week for the 12-week semester. He would choose 6, I would choose 6. We tried to make them books that were important in our own intellectual odyssey. No secondary sources. So we didn't want the kids studying about what people say about the author. We wanted them to engage the actual text, the arguments being made by Plato or Sophocles or St. Augustine or Marx or Strauss or Dewey or C.S. Lewis, all of whom we had on the reading list. And well, I mean, it was just a magical experience. I mean, you don't know what Nirvana is, so you've taught with his brother. And we had a great time. And the kids seemed to enjoy it. The trouble was, it was restricted, I think, to 16, if I remember the freshman seminar, and we had several hundred kids wanting to sign up, and we had to turn it away. We thought about that. Once we had done it, we said, we got to keep doing this. This is great. We'll vary the books, but we'll keep the approach. So we thought, well, maybe we could do it as a lecture course, and if 200, 300, 400 kids wanted to sign up, then we could do it that way. But we quickly figured out that that would destroy the magic of the thing. Plus, you know, you put two big mouths and show-offs in front of a group of, I mean, it wouldn't be the same. So, so we decided to keep it as a seminar, and we taught it every other year or so until Cornel abandoned me to go to First Union Theological Seminary and then Harvard, but he did. He was good enough to come back and teach it with me a couple of years ago, and we're gonna do it again. So that's how we met, and eventually we took the show on the road, and then eventually we were putting out statements together and writing op-ed pieces together, and the next thing after that was his wonderful daughter Zaytun got into both Harvard and Princeton, so she had to make a choice between her daddy and her Uncle Robbie, and she made the right choice, and she's at Princeton. That's it. You remember any different?
Oh, you're right about that. I want to begin by saluting you, though, brother. It's one of the great joys of growing older and being a teacher is to see the students flower and flourish, find their own voice, and engage in such high-quality dialogue. Duke University, you were blessed to have this distinguished scholar. His book is profound, Hope Draped in Black, and it's a timely book because it has to do with the ways in which you have to wrestle with despair in order to earn hope. You see, and to be a hope rather than just talking the abstract about hope. This is what you're looking at when you're looking at this brother here. I want to acknowledge his wife. Where is Sister Camilla? Where is she? Oh, there she is. There she is. Absolutely. She's a scholar. She's a scholar in her own right. At Chapel Hill as a fellow. I'm sitting here looking at Stanley Hauerwas. He, along with James Cone, two of the most powerful and important and influential theologians of their generation. He just gave me his recent book. I want to hug him for 5 minutes, but I only had 5 seconds because we go back almost 40 years. He's a vanilla Texas brother, and I'm a chocolate California brother. We have a deep, deep love and respect for each other, and we come together at the blood of the cross. And he's played, of course, such a fundamental role in the shaping of this institution of Duke University. No doubt about that. Randy Mattori, my God, what a distinguished scholar from Harvard, left Harvard to come to Duke. He was the one that stood up most consistently, most courageously when I was wrestling with my dear brother Larry Summers, the president of Harvard. We tried to keep it principled, but also keep it real. And that makes a difference. Oh, you there with your beloved wife? Oh, indeed, I haven't seen you in a while. All those wonderful dinners we had, I'm hugging you from a distance. Hugging you from a distance. When I come to Duke University, I think of Fred Jameson, who is the most sophisticated, the most important Marxist literary critic, historian, and cultural critic in the history of this nation. He's been at Duke now here for almost 35, 40 years. When you all see him, just give him a hug for me. And I'd say the same thing about Juanima Lubiano, who I was blessed to teach with at Princeton. I know she's been here at Duke. And I can't even begin my dialogue without acknowledging the fact that this is the institution, in part, that has produced the most Martin Luther King-like figure in our time, the William Barber III. This is very important. This is very, very, very important. It has everything to do with what Brother Robbie and I are about. Because when you talk about our relationship, and I would say it's more than a friendship, he's my brother. I love this brother. And love is never reducible to politics. Just like friendship is never reducible to political agreement. You learn how to revel in somebody's humanity, their laughter, their subtlety. Give them the benefit of being wrong and point it out. And the benefit of being right. Because we come together on a whole host of issues, religious liberties and wrestling with poverty. He's got more market-centered conceptions. I've got more market and government conceptions. But it's the quality of the person that we're talking about. And it has everything to do with acknowledging from whence you come. You see, I'm the second son of Irene and Clifton West on the chocolate side of Sacramento. I'm a product of Shiloh Baptist Church, the Reverend Willie P. Cook and Deacon Hinton and Sarah Ray, my vacation Bible school teacher. And I'll never, ever forget their commitment to character, what it means to be a human being, how you reach out and learn and listen, and then follow the anthem of black people. You lift your voice, every voice. Take that voice seriously, bounce off against other voices in order to enhance the quality of your voice. And so anytime I get a chance to spend time with my dear brother Robbie, and we do this at home, at his home, in my home, we do it in, we were just where were we just a couple of days? In California. California, Irvine, and so forth. We've done it with black schools, Erykah Badu's son's school in Dallas. We do it all around the country. And it's really a matter of trying to simply bear witness to a love and trying to stay on that love train. I see Professor Valerie Cooper. She knows what I'm talking about. It's a blessing to have you here for 5 years. Going back to when you were a teaching fellow at Harvard. Oh, we had some magnificent engagements with students then. But this is so very important because we're living in such a moment of spiritual blackout or whiteout, depending which term you want to choose. The relative eclipse of integrity, honesty, decency, generosity, surrender of a self, service to something bigger than you. When I was coming along, I was told every month, if the kingdom of God is within you, then everywhere you go, you ought to leave a little heaven behind. Now, what gets in the way of that heaven in your relationships? The greed, the arrogance, the condescension, the need to be the smartest in the room rather than the most loving and courageous. The idols of neoliberal culture tied to a predatory capitalism that gives us the sense that to be alive is to be stimulated and titillated and be involved in a survival of the slickest so we can end up being the richest and the smartest and live in some vanilla suburb in some mansion with some trophy spouse. How empty, how vacuous can you get? He and I come from a tradition of Christian soulcraft, where you can connect your humility to your moral tenacity. You're Socratic because you're suspicious of dogma, but there's certain dogma you're willing to live and die for, like love thy God and love thy neighbor. And for he and I, we love our enemies, and we get in a lot of trouble. You don't try that one on your own. You need a whole lot of grace for that. But you know that that's part and parcel of who you are. And you learn to follow Samuel Beckett that says, try again, fail better. Try again, fail better. That's the story of your life. Keeping in mind what constitutes moral and spiritual excellence given the gifts that you have received and what you cultivate, and yet you're going to fall on your face in the end. And we help each other in our brotherhood as we keep each other accountable, answerable, responsible with argument, but we know argument doesn't exhaust what intellectual life is about. You better situate yourselves in some stories and narratives that flow out of traditions of people who have honed it out over space and time, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. The Socratic legacies of Athens, prophetic legacies of Jerusalem. That includes our precious Jewish brothers and sisters of Judaism, Christians like ourselves, and our precious Muslim brothers in the great tradition of Islam. And then the openness to Buddhism and Hinduism, and of course, our deep love of our secular brothers and sisters. Oh, we love our agnostic and atheistic brothers and sisters. Very much so. But also engage them, not just cognitively, but also in terms of affection and in terms of orientation, looking for overlap. You see. And so in that sense, I would say, Brother Joseph, that it's a brotherhood. It really is. It's a sense of just enjoying each other and learning so much from each other. in so many different ways, especially when you're reading, great canonical texts too, my God, But he comes out of the Thomistic wing of Christianity, whereas I'm closer to Pascal and Kierkegaard. So we have some real intense issues that we wrestle with. Oh, yeah.
That actually segues. So that actually segues into my next question, right? Yeah. Christianity obviously is central for both of you, right? Can you talk about the ways in which Christianity is potentially a site for, agreement, consensus, but also where you have different interpretations of the tradition? And that's what you, right?
Let me lead into that by commenting on something that you asked before, which is, what is friendship? What is love? What is brotherhood? I think everyone would acknowledge, if you think about it, that there are both affective and volitional components of friendship, of love, of fraternity. I think that in our own society, in our own time, the accent has been placed very heavily on the affective component, leading people to what I believe is the erroneous conclusion that the active willing of the good of the other for the sake of the other, which is the essence of friendship in my view, and I think the Christian understanding, not just Christian. If we go back to Aristotle, if we look at the Nicomachean Ethics, I believe it's chapter 10, we get a very similar idea. There are obviously some big differences between the noble Greek pagans, including Plato and Aristotle, but there's some important points of commonality, and I think that's one. With that accent on the affective dimension, making it seem as though it's the affective that generates the volitional, I think we make a mistake. If anything, I think it's the other way around. Friendship is fundamentally volitional. It is willing the good of the other for the sake of the other. Now, in the normal course of things, unless you have an individual who is distinctly unlovable, and we can make ourselves into that kind of individual, unfortunately, but there's still some great heroes who love despite that, who love even the unlovable, something all Christians should aspire to do, but few of us can actually do it. But if we have it right, I think it's the volitional that generates where it would otherwise be absent, the affective. When we get to know a person because of our willingness to will the good of the person, then we can see the humanity in there. Where we fail is when we lose track of the other person's humanity. It doesn't mean we have to agree with them. It doesn't mean we have to approve them. It doesn't mean we have to approve what they do. It doesn't mean we have to approve of their views. It doesn't mean any of that. But it means to understand their humanity, the thing that's common between us and them. Now, another way of looking at it is to look at what is the antonym, what is the opposite of friendship. Well, here you have a lot of things. Hatred, you might say. That's true. Indifference. It's a very powerful point to recognize that indifference is more than hatred, the opposite of love or of friendship. But in a certain sense, the opposite of a friend really is an enemy. Cornel says, quoting our master, we must love our enemies. Hardest thing to do. Everything else comes naturally. Loving your friends comes naturally. Loving your family, even a little difficult, comes naturally. Loving your enemies does not come naturally. If there is a Christian teaching that challenges our human nature, it's that one. It is unnatural to love your enemies, and that makes it hard. But it helps if you understand the rest of the story, which is that if you want to know who your greatest enemy is, you know him or her already, and you know them pretty well, because it's you. It's me. I believe it was Solzhenitsyn who first said, although I've heard Cornel quoted so often that I would have ready to attribute it to him, the line between good and evil runs through every human heart. That's where the division is. It's not Republican, Democrat, progressive, conservative. It's really right through the human heart, where a certain war with ourselves because, from a Christian vantage point, of the reality of sin, of what Augustinian Christians call original sin. So that there's a war. There's us, and then there's that enemy, which is also us, which is me, that I'm struggling with against the best impulses that I have. So for me, the Christian faith, while it has its comforts and consolations, and many of our secular or atheist brothers and sisters think that that's what the attraction is, the comforts and consolations. That's a big mistake. Because serious Christians know that while there are comforts and consolations, the challenges and difficulties, the fact that you know that the best you can do, Cornel already said it, is fail, get yourself back up, try again, fail better the next time. And even those of us who lean more toward the Aristotelian Thomistic side than the Pascalian Kierkegaardian side agree on that.
That's right.
Agree on that. So it's a lifetime challenge to do the impossible, knowing that you will basically fail at it, but also having the comfort and consolation of knowing that success ultimately is not your job. You're relying on your Savior, that the battle has already been won, the victory has already been won. That doesn't mean you don't have to do your part. That doesn't mean we don't struggle. We do struggle, but it's at the core of our lives. And one of the things that I think is relevant to this conversation this evening that follows from that is that Christianity does require something that's less clear in the ancient tradition, and that is humility. It really is a virtue from a Christian point of view, including, and this is very difficult for those of us who earn our bread manipulating words and symbols, who lead the intellectual life, intellectual humility. That's really, really hard. But it's critical not only from the point of view of a Christian life, but also from the point of view of the academic or intellectual enterprise. If you lack that virtue of intellectual humility, I promise you, we all have had the experience, you will fall very deeply in love with your own opinions. And you will come to value your opinions, more than truth. You will not only want your opinions to be true, we all want our opinions to be true, it should be the other way around, we should want to have true opinions. But we'll not only want our opinions to be true, we will not want to have them challenged by other people or by ourselves. I've often said, Cornel Servant said, that one of the things about us frail, fallen human creatures is that we tend to wrap our emotions, that affective part, more or less tightly around our convictions, around our beliefs. We have deep, cherished, identity-forming beliefs. We wrap those emotions around them. Now, that in itself is not bad. In fact, that just considered in itself is good. It's because we wrap our emotions around our convictions that we'll get things done. Get the book written. Get the kids fed and off to school. Struggle for justice. Struggle for a worthy cause, or at least cause we believe and hope is worthy. If we didn't have that emotional oomph behind our convictions, we'd be sitting here and not doing anything. And yet, if the emotions are wrapped too tightly around the convictions, if it's too tight, then we become dogmatists. We become dogmatic. We're so deeply in love with what we already believe that we will not tolerate a challenge, and we will experience an intellectual challenge as a personal assault. And we will assume that the only explanation for somebody disagreeing with me is that they must either be stupid or malicious. And either one is no good. And of course, then we're not going to learn anything. We will choose as our friends only people who are going to reinforce what we already think. That'll be our circle of friends. People who are saying, I'm okay, you're okay. People who are reinforcing what you already believe. We will not challenge ourselves. We will be the opposite of Socratic. Dogmatic is the opposite of Socratic. And that's why it's so important to cultivate friendships with people who don't see things just the way you do. People who've had different sorts of experiences in life, come from different sorts of backgrounds, but also have different sorts of convictions. Now, the real question that the political theorists grapple with, the great John Rawls made this his life's work. I don't endorse his conclusions, but I believe it was a heroic struggle. The question that the great political theorists of our time struggle with is how thin a basic set of shared values can you have and still have enough that you can have a relationship in which you disagree that remains still and deeply and productively and fruitfully a friendship. How thin? And that's a special problem for America and Americans, because we are not a nation based on race, ethnicity, blood, soil. There are other nations that are built on those kinds, or even even language. And we can get into the debate about English and so forth, but that's not what makes us fundamentally Americans. It's rather the belief in a certain set of values, a political creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. When that had basically been forgotten, Lincoln reminded people of it. And then, 100 years later, Martin Luther King is reminding people, keep going back to that shared, and that's pretty thin. It means we disagree on a whole lot of other stuff. We can be democratic socialists, we can be civic Republican conservatives, we can be libertarians, we can be social democrats, with a whole bunch of other areas in which we disagree. Is that core set of beliefs articulated by Jefferson himself, who didn't live up to them, himself a slaveholder, had a lot of faults, he articulated that set of beliefs that is our foundation. Is it too thin to build on? The American proposition is that it's not. That we can not only survive, but flourish in the pluralism that is permitted based on that foundation. But some people tell us today, from both the right and the left, that can't be it. Too thin. We need a greater sharing. Everybody's got to agree with me, at least on this, and this. Those are the non-negotiables. I don't recognize you as a fellow citizen. I don't recognize you as someone who matters. I don't recognize you as anything but an enemy unless you agree to this, and this. That other stuff, that basics, is too thin. This is a big challenge for us as a people. I myself, just play my own cards on the table, I'm invested heavily. I'm perfectly willing to be challenged. I don't want to be a hypocrite here. Perfectly willing to be challenged. But my belief is it's not too thin. It's enough. We don't even have to have a shared faith. Religion is not what it's built on. Cornel and I happen to be Christians. This is a country with Muslims and Jews and Hindus and Confucians and Buddhists, people from all sorts of different traditions, including unbelievers, who at least are willing to sign on to that basic, admittedly thin, political creed. I think if you can do that, it works. And we can make a go of this thing. But we've got a big challenge from people, again, on both sides of the spectrum who are saying, nope, that is not enough. That will not do. We need more.
And I think in this moment in which there's such a profound crisis, tremendous scope and breadth, and the possibility of democratic practices being sustained, that what Brother Robbie's talking about is crucial. And in some ways it takes us back to Plato, because Plato provided the most profound critique of the possibility of democracy. He said it might be a nice idea, but it's a pipe dream because there's too much unruly passion and pervasive ignorance among the citizenry. So they'll be easily manipulated. They'll be even easily balkanized and tribalized, so that you won't have a notion of a public good or a larger public interest, which is a precondition of a democracy. That was the genius of Athens. Even though they had a slaveocracy in terms of its foundation in patriarchal households, The demies became the source of their identity rather than the tribe. So you had a possibility of a public. The echo of John Dewey's The Public and Its Problems. Show me a democracy that trashes public things, including public conversation. I'll show you democracy sliding down the slope of chaos. And in Plato's Republic, what is the result of every democracy? He says, tyranny, the tyrant. Because people look for the strong man, usually given the patriarchal legacy that feeds into most of the human condition up to now. You see. And then there's the Dostoevskian challenge, the brothers Karamazov. And this is a tough one, which is most human beings don't really want to be free. That's a pipe dream too. They're looking for magic. They're looking for charisma. They're looking for authority. They're looking for a Pied Piper to tell them what to do. They can't wait to fit into conformity. They can't wait to get into a mainstream in order to be recognized. That's Dostoevsky's critique of any democratic possibilities. And of course, he is the grand Christian who provided the most profound indictment of Christianity. That's called dialectical critique. You see. And it feeds directly into this thin stuff. Most democracies are very fragile. They're very precious. They tend not to last too long. That's what Ben Franklin said. That's what Thomas Paine said. That's what Thomas Jefferson said. If you don't renew the democratic possibilities, you're going to lose it. You see. And that's very real. That's very real. You see. And when de Tocqueville in that last chapter of Volume 1 said, the three races that inhabit this land, there will be no such thing as a multiracial democracy in America, de Tocqueville said, because as a Frenchman, I have spent so much time on the vanilla side of town. There's always a slice of abolitionists who are working, but they got a lot of cousins, a whole lot of cousins. And they will never, ever accept the full humanity and dignity of black people, not just the exceptional black people, not just the exceptional Negroes, not just the top slice of the black bourgeoisie who's very sophisticated and educated and part of the chattering classes and therefore lowers the ease in white context. We're talking about Precious Jamal and Letitia on the block. We're talking about the folks locked into the mass incarceration regime. If they are not respected, then the middle class Negroes ought not to be respected either. That's Malcolm. We're losing that. Why? Because you have to have a universal view. This is Hebrew scripture. To be human is to spread the steadfast love, to spread the loving kindness, the hesed, to the orphan, the widow, the motherless, the father, the least of these that Jesus will pick up on, you see. And so part of our challenge is as Christians, we do follow that wonderful formulation of probably one of the finest, if not the finest, Christian poet of the 20th century, W.H. Auden. How do we learn to love our crooked neighbor with our crooked hearts? But you got the Socratic critique built in. The person that you're loving is always already fallen, always already fallible, always already subject to certain kind of inadequacy, just like you. That's what it means to be human, you see. But how do you proceed in such a way that that kind of love becomes tied to justice? With Brother Martin, you say justice is what love looks like in public. And Otis Redding has tenderness is what love feels like in private. You see, if you can't be tender with people, can't be kind with people, you can't be gentle with people, you can't be willing to share a certain sweetness. And this is where the blues comes in. And we have a good time talking about this. Because, and this brother plays a serious guitar. Serious guitar. And I'm rhythm and blues and he's bluegrass, but we work it out. we work it out. A lot of dialectical movement going on there. But he started hitting that thing. I said, oh, Lord, put those blue notes in there. But reading this is very important because, again, it takes us back to the crisis of democracy, because the blues are narratives of catastrophe lyrically expressed. See, strange fruit, that's the blues. Catastrophe, American terrorism. Don't call it segregation. That's deodorized category. Keep that for the textbook. We're talking about terrorism. lynching, psychic, social, political, trying to convince people they're less beautiful, less moral, less intelligent. That's what white supremacy enacts in that particular context. Still enacted in this context. But at the same time, too, there is what we would call the charitable Christian hatred. And this is very important, where you have an intense hatred of the sin and still try to love the sinner, because the deeds of that sinner never completely exhaust the humanity of the sinner, because they can change. They can be transformed. They can undergo metamorphosis. And made in the image and likeness of God, just like you, which means the very thing that you're criticizing in terms of their gangster behavior, you've got gangster elements inside of you. You see. So me and Robbie would say quite explicitly, we both were gangsters before we met Jesus, and now we're redeemed sinners with gangster proclivities. Perennial process. Need for learning how to die in order to learn how to live. And you learn how to die by giving up the worst of you so that the best of you could emerge. But that best of you that does emerge is always already shot through with the same kind of gangster element. And it's a perennial process until the worms get your body. You see, it's a human thing. That's the kind of primates we are. That's the kind of animals with language we are. That's the kind of human beings made in the image and likeness of God that we are. Now, how do you get democratic projects off the ground? You got to have some connection with each other that recognizes those limitations, but still convinces you to try to transcend them without you ever ending in a pure space.
Democracy, as Cornel says, is extremely fragile. But I think that's fundamentally because civic friendship is extremely fragile. And since civic friendship is extremely fragile, that means any political order, whether it is democratic or not, any political order that you would want to live under, and if there's any political order that depends on civic friendship, is going to be fragile. A couple examples. The members of the Hutu tribe lived next to their neighbors of the Tutsi tribe for generations in peace, friendships, relationships. And then in a matter of what, months, not even years, descended into genocide. Genocide, not just, you're not going to invite you over for dinner anymore. Genocide. That's how fragile civic friendship is. Another example. On my father's side, we're ethnically Syrian. And 6 months, of course, we didn't realize this was going to happen, 6 months before Syria collapsed into civil war, I took my very elderly father, still living, 93, World War II hero. Yeah, still going. But I took him with some other people in my family, my brothers and my children, my wife, to Syria, where we visited the village where his people came from, and we saw Christians and Muslims living side by side. Now, it was a police state under Assad, believe me. And it had all the markings of a police state. One of those was you felt really secure. No crime problem. But yet, it was a police state. But Muslim neighbors next to Christian neighbors, and not just tolerating each other, interacting, purchasing at each other's stores, hiring each other for services, getting along. 6 months later, it descended into another genocidal nightmare. Civic friendship is very fragile. And so when you perceive the blackout that Cornel's talking about, or whiteout, whatever you want to call it, when you perceive that, the alarm bells should go off, because what's at risk is civic friendship. If we lose that, not only will we lose democracy, we will lose even the possibility of a benign autocracy or authoritarianism. What you will get, I promise you, is tyranny. Now, that doesn't give you an answer to what we do about it. And I've already said different people disagree about it. I've got a view, but we should recognize the problem. And then we can talk about what to do about it. The worst situation is when we refuse to recognize the problem. You know, it's like if someone is suffering from an addiction and nobody in the family is willing to admit there's an alcoholism or whatever the addiction is. You're never going to get anywhere except to the grave until somebody says, look, I don't know what to do, but let's acknowledge Dad's got a problem, or whoever it is has a problem. And then we can start at least to try to deal with it. And my friends, we have a problem. We have a problem.
I think it's 6:30, so hopefully we can now open it up, right, for audience questions for about 30 minutes.
No, wait, Professor. Yeah, I think there's a microphone.
The microphone is coming.
Thank you. I feel really fortunate to be here, and I really enjoyed your words. I was deeply moved by them. And congratulations, Professor Winter. I'm really happy for you. First, I would like to appeal for the inclusion of the practitioners of African religions and Native American religions among those who count to be human and part of the brotherhood and sisterhood of humankind.
Definitely.
Secondly, the paradox that I struggle with constantly is rooted in what you articulated, Professor George, as how thin the layer of commonality has to be in order for us to recognize our friendships, civic and personal. And the fundamental question is, in the dictum, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. Who counts as a man? And there's a perennial debate, an ongoing struggle over who counts. And in the essence of the nation state is the premise that the non-citizen is not quite a man. And in this particular nation state, that the fundamental, visible other side of that boundary is black people, and for some, gay people. And I'll just put in parentheses, there is some report that you oppose marriage as an option for gay people.
About marriage, that is absolutely right. We argue about that. Yes. I'm not going to back away from that.
Yes. So again, it suggests
it's not a question of humanity. Oh. And of course, we have this debate over the status of the child in the womb. Yeah. Let's be clear. It's a question about humanity. Who counts in the community of the commonly protected?
Who counts as part of the civic friendship on equal terms?
That's right.
So to me, the question is there a kind of civic friendship that doesn't obey the almost human universal that the strongest friendships are premised on the presence of a visible enemy or non-friend? That the strongest friendships, that the strongest forms of social solidarity are premised on there being an outsider who can be pointed at and says, we are one because there's an other who is not of us. I wonder what you would propose as a solution to that seemingly fundamental paradox or character of friendships, civil friendships, nation states, social solidarity of all sorts.
Question, no, brother. Profound. You want me to start off on that?
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Definitely, because we could be here until tomorrow morning. No, we have a seminar together, Brother Randy. Because, see, I believe that on the one hand, the dominant orientation of the kind of people creatures that we are, does presuppose an other that tends to be degraded and demeaned. But that's the dominant one. There's always counter-dominant, counter-hegemonic voices, forces, practices that call that into question. Call that into question. So for example, in the United States, you got a number of white brothers who say, well, we include black people. And that takes a whole lot of work, because white supremacy cuts very deep in this culture. But then the question becomes, well, what about the indigenous people? You got people running around, slavery was America's original sin. No, that's a lie. That was the second one. You got indigenous people who had a white supremacist encounter with Europeans. And the same would be true with our Jewish brothers and sisters, and our Muslim brothers and sisters, and our Arab brothers and sisters, our Palestinian brothers and sisters, Yemenis, and so forth and so on. How do we have an all-embracing, universal, not just vision but practice, but shaped and socialized in dominant forms that are exactly what you say? Exactly what you say. Now, democracies at their best, because unfortunately most of the democracies in the world have been democracies tied to imperial structures of domination. Manifest destiny. Patriarchal domination. Homophobic, transphobic domination. Calling into question the humanity. Now see, that's a certain level. People have arguments in terms of ways in which we go about trying to generate different kind of policies and so forth. But in terms of the fundamental humanity of all of those groups that I've talked about, have to be something that is predicated, a fundamental premise. And that means you're already moving in the world but not of the world. Because the world in its dominant forms is precisely what you say. It's the history of oppression, domination, degrading others of some sort, you see. But the countervailing forces calling that into question, but usually rather weak. Those voices get crushed. They get misunderstood. They get marginalized. They get trashed, and so forth and so on. But they bounce back. That's the beginning of an answer to your question. But I just don't want the dominant conception in which the other is degraded to be viewed as somehow essentialized, the only natural and normal way with no other options. That's what I would be resisting, you see. We go right ahead, though, brother.
Human freedom is both our friend and our enemy. By this I mean metaphysical freedom, freedom of the will, is both our friend and our enemy when it comes to this. The great social psychologist Jonathan Haidt recently published a comment which began with, "I have some depressing news." And as a social psychologist, he didn't follow it up with, "I also have some good news." It was just, "I have some depressing news," and that is the social science tells us that success in social life correlates very heavily with people being like each other. That pluralistic cultures tend over time to be less successful and more fragile. Now, let's assume the social science is right. And remember, Haidt is going against his own preferred view here. He would want it to be the opposite. He would want it to be true what we like to tell ourselves, which is our diversity is our strength, right? We always say that. We all want that to be true. Haidt wants it to be true, but he says the data don't show it. All right. Now, if we didn't have free will, if we were tigers or squirrels or something, then that would be the story, and we would now know how to plan for the future, better avoid pluralism or too much pluralism. People do better when they're in their own tribes and groups and bodies, their own people with people like them. But because we do have free will, we're not bound forever in whatever the social scientists tell us has been the trend or the norm in the past. We can, by acts of the will, change the reality. Now that takes leadership. It takes education. It takes role models. It takes prophets. And I'll tell you something else. It always takes, and I think this will never change. This I think we're stuck with. It takes martyrs. You don't get there without somebody paying the price, somebody willing to sacrifice for something greater, for other people. So I don't read the social science that John points to and say, well, time to give up. Trying to give up on the thin stuff. You need thick. You need so thick, you need blood and soil. And plenty of people are going to tell us that today. You need blood and soil. The idea of a creedal nation, it's a pipe dream. That's crazy. It's not going to work. It's been tried. failed. I'm not going to give up, but I realize that that means a lot of work on the human will in leadership and in education and in role modeling and in prophecy. And remember that in doing all that stuff, necessary, vital stuff, every step of the way we have to recognize I could be wrong. I might be leading people, but leading them down the wrong path. I may be very confident in my view. Maybe all right people are thinking this today. But maybe all right-thinking people are wrong. Maybe the view that I hold seems to be the humane, compassionate view. Compassion has been the road to death before, could be the road to death again. Doesn't mean don't be compassionate. It means be critical, self-critical. Do the work. Act on your beliefs. Cornel and I would be hypocrites if we told you not to act on your beliefs, not to be activists, but be self-critical activists. Always wondering, gee, have I made a mistake? Am I on the wrong side of this? Maybe it's not so obvious. Maybe what everybody thinks, or all the people who are like me, or all the people that I associate with who are reinforcing me or telling me about this, that, or the other thing are wrong. Maybe it's the people who I think are real no-goodniks who are right about this. And that's hard to do. That takes that virtue of intellectual humility, and it takes courage. It takes courage because it means you're putting stuff at risk, like friendships with people who do agree with you. It means not knowing who you might turn out to be. You think you're this person, but on reflection, you change your views, you might be a different person than you recognize. This is, Cornel and I talk about this when the subject is liberal arts education. I say getting a serious liberal arts education and not just having it put into you, doing the work yourself to get a serious liberal arts education is just like getting on a train to a destination where you know you're going to get off, but you don't know what the destination is. And worse yet, you don't know who you're going to be when you get off the train because it's transformative. A liberal arts education challenges you. It unsettles you. It makes you question even your most cherished, deepest identity-forming beliefs. It's not easy leading a fully human life in that way. End of sermon. There'll be a chapel and everything, right?
Hi, thank you so much for this evening. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Jennifer Atala. I just moved here out of the blue a bit from the Middle East. I was living both in Israel and in Palestine, which is going to be the premise of my question. My mom is here with me, and I think a bit mortified that I'm asking a question. Sorry, Mom. She sent me to University of Chicago, so she knows what is happening now, I think, better with your explanation of great books, education, and liberal arts, so thank you. So I'm a Palestinian American and Israeli citizen because my family were internally displaced refugees. And I've spent the last 20 years living the ways that and learning how I can best contribute to conversation, awareness, and social justice. And it's transformed so much over the last 20 years, and I really appreciate what you've just shared. That resonated with me. The last 4.5 years, I've been literally living and having lived personal experience and professional experience amongst all different types of communities, secular, religious, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, in the Galilee, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Ramallah, all over the West Bank, all over the region, and it's transformed me, and what's come out of that is I've found myself in a position where I'm between my Christian upbringing and my sort of Buddhist philosophy that I embrace, found a place where I can create space to connect and love people that I can also disagree with, and it's okay, it's not mutually exclusive that you can have strong opinions and narratives and still love and connect. And that's been the premise of my work. And part of why I've moved here, literally a month ago, is because it was the loneliest journey I've ever been on. And I'm going to get emotional saying this. Thank you. The criticism from my own community, from the Palestinian American community, and also from the Palestinian indigenous community, which I am both, is the hardest to bear, because I obviously believe I've done and I'm acting in a way that is the best way to move forward. But when you face criticism and hatred and sort of quickness to judgment from your own community, that is so difficult. And so I'm curious to know, from your perspectives, having had obviously much more richer journey, but a similar journey of connecting across and still loving and having your opinions and integrity, how do you do that with humility, the leading that you've done through your own self-awareness and journey, but also how do we're human, how do you deal with that criticism and judgment from the community that you feel you are trying to move forward? I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well, Cornel's never been criticized, so maybe I should... You had that experience. You have had that experience. You want to start?
I'm on intimate terms with coming out of very magnificent communities that have been highly critical of me. Where'd you go? There you are. Yeah, absolutely. Because the thing is that you don't love any community. I don't love black people in order for black people to love me back. I love black people because they're worthy of being loved. And the truths that I try to put forward and the witness that I try to bear that comes out of the very best of that community as I understand it is connected to an integrity that has little to do with popularity. So you get ready to be alienated. You get ready to be misunderstood. That's all right. You have to be humble enough to learn and listen from folk, because they still got some truths to tell through their own lens, you see. Edward Said came out of the Palestinian community. He was deeply criticized by other Palestinians. He was demonized by the mainstream. He was demonized by many conservative and centrist Jews. Many progressive Jews like Noam Chomsky had him over to the house every other weekend. So it was a human thing. The question is, how do you humanize it in such a way that certain truths become in some ways non-negotiable? So that, for example, in the Palestinian situation, do we really believe that a Palestinian baby has exactly the same significance as an Israeli Jewish baby? That's a moral truth. You can have your analysis, you can engage in an argument over policy, but you got to make that explicit. And if in fact that's not the case, serious critique must be brought to bear. We say the same thing about Armenians vis-a-vis Turks. Same thing about Dalits vis-a-vis Brahmins. Same thing about what's going on in Kashmir or Tibet vis-a-vis their respective occupiers and so forth. So that you yourself saying, I'm going to be a person of integrity, get ready for, in my Christian language, bearing your cross. See? And that's a real beautiful thing, to bear your cross, because it means that cross signifies your quest to unarmed truth and unapologetic love. And most people who make that kind of commitment are on the way to character assassination, or literal assassination, or crucifixion, or being misunderstood and trashed and so forth. To be a polished professional usually means don't get too close to that cross. Not if you want to be accepted in the mainstream, because the mainstream is all about conformity. But if you're going to be a love warrior in that professional context, get ready for your professional cross. You see.
Well, I first want to say I think that what you're trying to do is very admirable. Second, there's nothing pathological at all about wanting to be affirmed, wanting people to think well of you, wanting to be loved. We're made to be loved. Not in some emotional, sentimental, or even purely affective sense, but in the sense in which we were talking about it earlier, the willing of the good of the other for the sake of it. We want to be not only loving, but the person whose good is willed for our own sake by others. But this is a vale of tears, and you're experiencing that right now, where people are so dug in to their ideologies or their experiences or their identities that they perceive any questioning of that, even if it's done lovingly, even if it's done mildly. I can tell you're a mild person, even the way you're doing it, they experience it as an assault, as an attack on us, on our community, on our values, and in your case, of course, a betrayal. A betrayal. And so what you're experiencing, the pain you're experiencing, not pathological, it's the natural human reaction to betrayal. Because really, they are betraying you. They don't realize that's what they're doing. They think you're the betrayer. But they are betraying you, losing sight of your humanity in their unwillingness to allow you to question the dominant orthodoxies in the community that you belong to. Believe me, Cornel and I have both had this experience in our communities. Now, I don't know how you bear that alone. The Christian attitude is we must be Christ-like, yes, and Christ dies not quite alone. The women, the holy women at the foot of the cross, and only one of the apostles, only John, the youngest, the apostle whom Jesus loved. All the others, including Peter, run. Peter betrays him 3 times and says he doesn't know him and so forth. It is important, I think, for us, because this is the natural reaction, to find those, even if it's just few, those few who will hold us up and affirm us in the face of that suffering. But you must not insist, we must not insist that they agree with us. See, it's a two-way street here. We don't insist that they can't insist that we agree with them. We stand for our right to disagree lovingly without having our love for them being questioned because we disagree with their politics or their moral views or their religion or what have you. But it also works the other way around, and it's not wrong to demand that I too have the right to be loved despite my disagreeing with you in a loving way. I think this gentleman here has a hand up.
Yeah, I got one. So I've been hearing the conversation, and what happened? Corey Wilkins, I'm an MDiv student here. So I've been hearing the conversation, and I've been trying to understand, but I need some help because I think, as I've always understood it, the notion of friendship has to not only does there have to be common ground in terms of like some form of a belief system on even a base or small level, but on a power dynamic level as well. Like, it's very difficult to have friendship across a line where there's a stark power dynamic. And I've been struggling with parts of the conversation because I don't necessarily know that like there's some belief systems we can hold that we can say, okay, we agree to disagree on, but we're still friends. And there are some belief systems that we hold, though other bases of our foundation might be the same, that will not allow, that in my opinion, I would struggle to be friends with. Like when I get people sitting up talking to me about how you got babies basically in concentration camps at the border and might never be reunited with their friends, but and that's okay with them, but okay, Corey, you cool, like you not one of them. That's a struggle for me. And so I think like it's almost in what I'm hearing from you guys sometimes, and correct me if I'm wrong, but a notion that somehow the slave and the slave master could have been friends given that a common ground was reached. And I don't know that I really want to understand, like, because I just don't.
That's I wasn't going to say profound, but I'm looking for a more profound word than that. No, but the thing about it is that, you see, when you talk about the slaveholder and the slave, there's a number of different contexts. It's not just an asymmetry of power in relation to sun up, sun down, torture, going to be dead at 27 years old, the 244 years that black people had to deal with in this country, or 200 years ago in this very space where we are right now, you see. But that's one context, crucial, must be focused on, but there's a whole host of other dynamics that people have, you see. There's no way under God's heaven that the first mass entertainment in the history of America were the minstrels with blackface. What did that mean? That meant that even the slaveholders felt that these enslaved Africans seemed to have certain kinds of power they didn't have, given all their political power, all their economic power, that somehow they actually were subordinate to them. And so they wanted a piece of it. They wanted everything, from styles of how to walk and talk, styles of how to orient themselves. How do you survive this? If this were happening to me, we would have a massive Ku Klux Klan movement rather than produce Frederick Douglass and Martin King. That's the dominant orientation, you see. So that there's ways in which there's forms of power that must be acknowledged as opposed to simply political and economic power. When that's the case, then it's a possibility of overlap in terms of humanity. This is true in terms of capitalists and workers. Can a worker who's being exploited across the board ever have a friendship with a capitalist who seems to be obsessed with property, with gain? Can a woman ever have a friendship with we men, given most of us got insecure egos concerned about trying to get over and can't deal with a free woman? You see what I mean? Yes, we know that certain women can still deal with the patriarchal men. Can a gay and lesbian sister, a trans person come to terms with straight folk, given our ways of... Yes, there's overlap, but it's a very difficult one. And your question is a crucial one, because if you downplay your question, you go into with a mamby-pamby Disney World kind of relationship, which is not friendship. You see, I mean, what we have is not Disneyland and Disney World. This ain't no Main Street Peter Pan kind of thing. Oh, no, I mean, that's true. You're talking about praying together, wrestling together, fighting together, sacrificing together, concerned with loved ones and so forth and so on. That's what happened. And I do believe that when we have these multiple contexts, we begin to see the possibilities of the overlap, even given the vicious kinds of structures of domination that are always in place. Can Americans have a relationship with Yemenis when we've been dropping bombs on their innocent folk all these years, for be it Obama, be it Bush, be it Trump, and they wonder, what kind of people are these Americans dropping bombs on our children, and you don't even have a public discourse on the drones? What kind of people are you? And you say, oh, my God, I didn't really know. I didn't see it on MSNBC, and certainly I didn't see it on Fox. I didn't know all this was going on. Yes, you've been killing us. You see what I mean? And you go to the Yemenis, brothers and sisters. When you come to America, come from Palestine, Gaza, can we actually have friendships with Americans when 551 babies in Palestine are killed in 50 days and not one public official can say a mumbling word? And most of our academicians can hardly say a word. Most of our preachers can't say a word. How come? Because they're scared. They don't want to be nonconformists. They'll be viewed as anti-Semite. Well, you don't want to be a hater of Jews. That's an evil. That's wrong. You want to be a lover of Palestinians and Jews and Lebanese and Yemenis and Americans and Guatemalans and Ethiopians across the board. So this is a long answer, still inadequate to your question. But it's one we have to wrestle with, because if, in fact, we remain preoccupied with just that one context, then we're going to miss out on so much of the histories that have sustained us and the possibilities of coalition and alliances that can change things. And yet, if we downplay your question, it's sounding brass and tinkling cymbals. It's just too empty. Did I begin to wrestle with it a little bit, though, brother? No, absolutely. But you said a little. Yeah.
Just a brief crack at it. The Christian faith and Christian moral teaching are not self-evidently true. It's possible that they could be wrong. That's certainly a logical possibility. There are many different alternatives, not only other religions, but views such as utilitarianism, Marxism, Nietzscheanism. That's the real challenger, by the way, but we don't have time to get into that. That's the real challenge to Christianity. It comes from Nietzsche, the will to power. But from the Christian vantage point itself, it's hard to be a Christian because it is hard to love your enemies, even your political enemies. And that's, I think, the challenge that you've put. And so people who just aren't buying it, just can't buy it, will look at people who answer your question by saying, you know, yeah, as extreme a case as it is, the slave should be friends, can be friends with the slave master. People will look at that person who says that and say, that's just crazy, that's impossible, that's not being serious about what you believe, that's becoming the friend of the evil, not just the person who supports evil, that's becoming the friend of the evil itself. In fact, before long, just to use the example of Martin Luther King, whose Christian faith drove him to those kinds of conclusions, people like Malcolm X are going to come along and say, you know the difference between King and me? He's a house Negro. I'm a field Negro. If you haven't seen the speech, you probably have, but if you haven't seen the speech in which Malcolm X makes that claim, that's a powerful speech. It's a powerful indictment. It doesn't even actually mention King's name. You have Stokely Carmichael mocking King as the Lord. Mocking. Because of King's Christian, in this case, going all the way to the most extreme view, pacifism. Now, you know, people who are externally even the best of Christians have trouble living up to that or even accepting it. I argue with my fellow pro-lifers. They say, well, look, a lot of people, a lot of pro-lifers say, well, look, I can't be friends with people who support abortion. I mean, that's just it. I mean, if you're for killing babies in the womb, the mass slaughter we've had since Roe versus Wade, there's no way I can be a friend of yours. Well, that's just an un-Christian attitude. I'd say the same thing to the person who said, I cannot be friends with somebody who endorses an immigration policy that separates families, separates children from their mothers. Same thing. I happen to dislike that policy too. I'm consistent on those issues. But if someone is willing to have a discussion with me about that, I'm willing to listen. And I'm willing to be that person's friend. We're going to disagree profoundly about that, but we're going to be that person's friend. Now, if I don't know that I would be there if I looked at the menu of options, considered the arguments, and came down in favor of Marxism, or Nietzscheanism, or utilitarianism, or perhaps some other faith. But as a Christian, that's where I am.
Handed the microphone. I'm sorry if I wasn't supposed to speak at the moment. But I just wanted to ask a question about the people who oppose democratic liberalism in the first place. So I want to know what sorts of arguments do we make to convince others that this model of civic friendship, this model of democratic liberalism is something we ought to follow. So I've heard as a PhD student, I've been in academia for 4 years now, but I've heard from the right say the argument that democratic liberalism isn't just something that will fail, but something that ought not to be because it doesn't value the good. So we should have, say, instead, a model of authoritarian theocracy because we could more effectively instantiate the good through having a sort of direct law. I've heard this argument. I've also heard from the left that the only way to respond to crises and, to the patriarchy, to racism, et cetera, is with violence because violence is the only thing that operates. The only thing that we're subject to is power. So what do you do when you feel that the people you're talking to are making arguments that have incommensurable principles with your own? How do you convince them that democratic liberalism, that civic friendship, ought to be a thing to be valued? Not merely that it can survive, but that it should be.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that question. Well, one is that, what Brother Robbie and I are doing here, though, we're not exemplifying democratic liberalism. You see, we're both very critical of aspects of democratic liberalism in terms of this atomistic conception of human beings, in terms of its notion that somehow religious people are more prone to authoritarian means as opposed to forms of liberalism itself can become so dogmatic and even have authoritarian ends and aims. So we're trying to Socratize this thing. Now, I'm a revolutionary Christian on the left. He's a profoundly revolutionary Christian on the right. When I say revolutionary in terms of you're still trying to keep track of this activity in the present that is in but not of the world. So that whatever the idols are. See, liberalism itself can become an idol, a blinder. I think there's some wonderful things about liberalism in terms of defense of rights and liberties, separation of powers and so forth. But we don't know a liberalism early on that wasn't patriarchal and imperial. And of course, American liberalism was white supremacist up until still going on. You see what I mean? So that we don't want to just start off thinking, well, this is, the aim is to save democratic liberalism. No, it is to come in with our own ways of perceiving the world in which we acknowledge the best of liberalism, the best of the Enlightenment, the best of Judaism, the best of Christianity, the best of Islam, the best of traditional and indigenous and African religions and so forth and so on. They all got something to say. Very important, you see. The best of polytheism. David Hume makes this point in The Natural History of Religion. It tends to be more tolerant than monotheistic. But when, in fact, people say, well, the only option is violence, you say, well, let's just see. What context are you talking about? If we're fighting against Hitler in 1939 and 40, you might have a strong case. Because I believe in just war. Now, we got one of the most magnificent Christian theologians right here in the room I mentioned before, Brother Stanley, coming out of the rich left wing of the Reformation with Martin King and Desmond Tutu and other pacifists saying, oh, you're going down the road to war. He is absolutely right to keep us under check, you see. But if the United States will form a strong alliance with the Soviet Union, communists, you can rest assured we had run out of options.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, when Brother Trump the other day was talking about U.S. soldiers falling from heaven to save our precious Jewish brothers and sisters with the indescribable evil of the Holocaust. And you say, well, you know, there were some Soviet army folk there too. They must have come from hell, but they had an alliance. And you ask our precious Jewish brothers and sisters who was there to save them from those vicious camps. It was Soviet and American troops. It wasn't just United States. Let's be truthful. Let's tell the truth about it. I would say the same thing about South Africa. When Nelson Mandela, as the Methodist that he was, and this is very important, we know the Methodist roots of Duke, Trinity College all the way back. Methodist to the core. He says, we tried everything, and they still killing us. They're raping the women that we love, and they're crushing our babies. We are going to form the spear of the nation, which is exactly what he did. Violence. So that a just war theory that comes out of Augustine is not anything to be played with, but people who think if we have exhausted all of the nonviolent possibilities, then sometimes you do opt for violence, right? And most importantly, though, you keep track of the institutionalized violence of the very status quo that people are talking about. You see? Because too often people who are suspicious of vulnerable people, when they talk about violence, don't have a whole lot to say about the institutional forms of violence happening every day that they are not aware of, that are creating wounds and scars to people generation after generation after generation. We've seen this under colonialism in Asia, in Africa, and so forth. So again, not an adequate answer to your question, but one of trying to say, how do we allow for that space in which we can have respectful communication, respectful argument, respectful conversation? But some of those voices are still going to be open to forms of violence in the same way that most of my fellow citizens are very much open to violence in Afghanistan and Pakistan and who knows, maybe Venezuela any minute. You don't know.
Just very quickly. So I think the question you've raised is a very important one.
Yes.
I've made my academic career mainly as a critic of liberalism. But in my very first book, Making Men Moral, Civil Liberties and Public Morality, in its very first sentence, I said that any critic of a tradition of thought and practice who aspires to be in the least bit fair-minded must begin by paying tribute to the achievements of that tradition. And the liberal tradition is not without its achievement. I say that again as a critic. Many of those achievements have to do with basic civil liberties. And the elements that you're now talking about, and they're very serious, and they have an argument. People you're talking about who are critical of what we call liberal democracy. And you find them across the spectrum, from left to right, again, and in different religious faiths. There's a war going on within Catholicism right now about this, and you find it in other traditions of faith. Their danger, to me, is throwing out the baby with the bathwater, throwing out the basic civil liberties on which we rely for any kind of decent and humane future, especially in a pluralistic world. We are no longer in tribes. Certainly here in the United States, we are now extremely pluralistic. If we, under pressure from the critique of so-called liberalism, if we give up religious freedom, freedom of speech and expression, freedom of assembly, due process, these basic civil liberties rights, I promise you it will not be the rich and powerful who pay the price. It will always be the most vulnerable. We may be tempted to say it's those people exercising their civil liberties, protecting the wrongdoing. And sometimes that's going to be true because you can abuse civil liberties. It happens all the time. Use them for bad ends. And yet, in this vale of tears, they are essential protection. So in a funny way, I find myself now criticized as a, quote, liberal, unquote. I mean, no one's more surprised than me, 33 years into my academic life, to be not only accused of, but criticized for being a liberal. I mean, I was the guy who, don't you remember people that but there we are. Now, that does not mean that their argument can or should be just dismissed or treated in the relatively cavalier manner that, I'm forced to treat it in answering a question at the end of a discussion like this. I mean, this is a matter for deep deliberation. We're in a crisis of liberal democracy, no question about that, as we were in the 30s. And as there were alternatives put on the table and argued for in the 30s, there are alternatives now being put on the table and argued for. And I think it's incumbent on us to engage and to address and to treat them seriously and to treat the people who are making them seriously. Yeah, there needs to be a quality control. It's just not, you don't have to take every argument, no matter how loony, seriously. But there are serious people now who are calling into question basic premises of liberal democracy, and they have to be engaged. You agree with that? Oh, absolutely.
So, unfortunately, we have to come to a close. There is a reception, right, right out in the quad, right? So please join me in giving our guests a hand, right? This is great.